So when we talk about working with color in InDesign, InDesign, as you see here, really streamlines pretty much everything, again, because it's a page layout, print output, or not just print output, but web and whatever. But it's an output application. So again, when we go to our swatches, that's why we don't have, you'll notice we don't have all those default swatches like Illustrator or Photoshop does, essentially because they want to streamline everything, and everything is done with a specific purpose or specific intent, especially color, because once you get extra color information or things that you don't necessarily need, it can complicate things or lead to mistakes, or just lead to output not being what you want. So what you need to do is you need to create all the colors that you're going to be working with in InDesign. You need to create them, which really isn't that difficult. It's just sort of an extra step that you need to do, right? Especially, again, if you guys have experience with any of the Adobe programs or other programs where you've been working with color and creating swatches. Some of the important things that we need to know about working with color and working with print output are things like process colors, which is anything created with the Cmyk, cyan, magenta, yellow, black, are called process colors because it's essentially everything that goes into the four-color mix, the printing process, I guess, but the color separation process, the printing process, so they call them process colors, is basically just any of the mixes of the Cmyk. So technically, it's a little bit different, but technically when you're outputting anything in Cmyk, it's process colors, whether you're going to a laser or whether you're getting more specific and going to a rip station, doing color separations, sort of technically for silk screening, but not really because you're using whatever inks, but you're still doing those color separations, so things like that. Anytime when you're processing the colors with this four-color process, you can create lighter colors of these process inks with smaller percentages of inks, darker colors, or with higher percentages. I guess obviously, by mixing CMYKs, you can produce a large variety of colors, et cetera, et cetera. We kind of all know this. You can obviously reproduce color photographs, like even this photograph here in the background is just made up of the four-color process. It's just a blend of the four different colors to get you the image and the image output that you want. Not all photography, this is getting more specific, but not all photography, as a side note, is Cmyk, is process color. There's also lab colors. There's all sorts of other different color processes. But for what we're doing and what we're doing with InDesign and in this class, we are just going to be concerned about process colors. So to create a new process color, there's a couple different ways, of course, like anything else in Illustrator. There's a few different ways you can do it. The sort of easiest way or most informational way to do it is you click on your contextual menu here, and I'm just in our Essentials workspace. So I have my color, and I think it opens up minimized. And I tend to open these up if I'm going to be working this way, which you'll see the reason for doing that later. I tend to work this way so that I have my color, my Cmyk sliders here, and my swatches open at the same time. Because if you're working minimized, you know how you click here and then you mix a color and then you want to bring it to your swatches palette. When you click that, it closes the other palette. So when I'm working with color, it's one of the few times that I personally have my my workspace not minimized. Like generally, I want as much real estate on my screen as I possibly can. Anyway, so what we're gonna do is, since I have this purple already going here, we're gonna do new color swatch, and it's just gonna default to whatever you had your last color, whatever your last color mix was. I was playing around with color before, so that's why I have this funky purple. So your new color swatch, when you open the window, you can see here It's going to name the swatch the CMYK mix. You can turn that off if you would like to turn that off, and for the assignment there's a couple spots where you do turn that off. And you can name your color whatever you want. So let's do, I don't know, let's do a violet red or whatever. And then this here, the color type, defines what type of color it is, whether it's process or spot. And spot I'll get into after we talk about process colors a little bit. Spot colors are things like Pantone colors or any other color matching types. I was blanking on the word. Color matching systems, but primarily Pantone color matching system, the PMS system, is what is generally the industry standard. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So any kind of mix that we're going to be doing like this is going to be a process color. And then here you have your color modes. And you can see we have our lab, CMYK, RGB if you're working with web or screen stuff. And then here you have a whole bunch of other crazy options, all these different color processes, focal tone, our Pantone, the Toyo color match. Anyway, these are all different specific color matching systems. But for right now, we're going to be concerned with our process color and CMYK. So let's say we have, you can move your sliders around here. Let's say we want this to be, go to about 70, give or take. I'm just kind of like arbitrarily creating this violet reddish color. And then I'm actually going to, excuse me, I'm actually going to uncheck this, adding it to the CC library. This is a relatively new function. You can add your colors to your Creative Cloud if you want to. I don't. So I'm going to turn that off. Again, that's, if you want to do that, that's up to you. But anyway, so I just kind of arbitrarily created this sort of violet red, as I called it, color. And it's a process color because we mixed through the Cmyk sliders. And then we're just going to hit OK. And then you see now we have this violet red to use in our colors, right? So that's essentially how we create colors in InDesign. Now, any color that we've created that way is called a named color and is added to the swatches panel here. Obviously, there's our violet red that we've created, so that's called a named color. And whether you name it, you can see here, here's another named color that's named from the Cmyk mix. That's, I just kind of messed around a little bit. That's 2% cyan, bless you, 2% cyan, 56% yellow. It's another named color. It's just named for the Cmyk mix instead of an actual arbitrary name. But basically, a named color, you can think about it as kind of like a saved color. So any color that is in your swatches panel is going to remain in that swatches panel within the document. It's not going to go document to document. That doesn't mean you can't copy colors from document to document. But like if I close this down and then the next time if I open a blank document, it's not going to have this violet red or this yellow in it, right? But it'll be saved as long as you have it within this document. You can also mix colors.
So when you reopen the document, that color will be there?
Yes. Yep, when you reopen the document, yes, the color will always be here, yes, because you saved it. So what ends up happening is if you, let's say for argument's sake, you know, you have this color here. So I went to my color panel, and all I did, since it filled with our violet red there, I went to our Cmyk sliders. So let's say we want to sort of arbitrarily make this like a lime greenish, whatever, and you use this circle or this ellipse for, you know, whatever, for like a heading here, and you leave it like that, and then you're going to fill this later. And then you save this, right? This green is not in our color palette, in our swatches palette, right? And that's an unnamed color. Now, as long as we have this shape, this, it's not physical technically, but you know what I mean? This physical shape in our document, this color is not going to go anywhere, right? Because we're actually filling a shape. But if we don't name that color, or if we don't save that color, if we delete it and then close the document and then reopen and whatever, it's gone, right? So that's one of the things, one of the really good things about about using these named colors is it'll save all the colors that you use or potentially will use, right? You don't have to. I know lots of people that don't. You don't have to save your colors, but you just have to keep in mind that as long as you don't have, that's the wrong way to put it. You don't have to save your colors, but if you're using a color and you don't have it saved as a named color, and you delete whatever text or object or whatever is using that color, then potentially that color can be gone forever. So if you don't write that down, or if you don't remember what mix that was, then you're you lose that color, right? So let's say we like this kind of gross pea green I have going on, and let's say you want to save this color. You can do one of two things, or probably more than two, but I'll show you two. One of two things is you can hit that new color swatch, and then it brings up your menu options, and it has the mix already there, and then you can go through basically the same steps that I did. Or you can hit your new color swatch down at the bottom of your palette. I don't know why I have my palette open so wide, but you can hit your new swatch, and basically what that does is it essentially skips opening that window, and it just creates a new whatever the last defaulted things you use. So it's going to be process Cmyk, and then it's going to name it with a swatch name. It's going to kind of always default, or rather the mix name. It's going to always default to name with a mix name. So if you do want to rename this, you just have to double click, and then it opens up that palette. Generally, again, this is one of the few times that when I'm creating a new swatch, it's one of the few times that I'll actually go to the contextual menu first, just because I like to rename my swatches anyway, so it just kind of saves an extra step. It's really, I mean, it's 2 seconds, but whatever. It saves an extra step. The other thing you can do, I'm going to delete this color. Okay. So this is another thing. So when you delete this color, when you delete a color, what it's going to do is it's asking you, actually, I'm sort of jumping ahead, but you'll see. So since I have an object selected with this color, and I'm deleting this color, it's going to ask you what to replace it with. You can't just like leave it there, right? Since the color is in use, it's essentially kind of like linked. So it's asking you what to replace that color with. So you can either select black or violet red or an unnamed swatch. Let's see if we can pick that. No. So we're just going to hit unnamed swatch so that it stays that green, right? So if we replaced it with any of the other colors, it would obviously replace it with those colors. I wanted it, I could have easily just hit undo, but I wanted this green to stay because I want to show you another way of saving a swatch. But basically, if you're deleting anything, if you're deleting a color here that's in use, like for argument's sake, oops, that's not what I want to do. I want to deselect. So I'm not selecting any object, but I'm selecting the color. If I delete this color, since it's not in use, it's not going to give me that warning, right? But since I was deleting that color, I don't know if I can go back there. Yeah, so since I'm deleting this color and it's in use, it's going to ask me to replace that color because it needs some kind of color information, right? Does that make sense? So we're just going to have it replaced with an unnamed swatch, which isn't going to change the color. It's just going to leave it an unnamed swatch. So you'll see that goes away, and now our name's okay. So instead of hitting new color swatch or new color swatch down here, you can also drag and drop just by clicking and dragging. You see you get this little hand with a plus, and you can drop it right underneath. It's basically the same, not basically, it is the same as hitting your new swatch. So again, if you want to change the name, you still have to double click. to get the information and then uncheck this. So that's why I usually go to the contextual menu there. It's one of the rare times I go to the contextual menu. Happens more in InDesign than other applications for me. I don't know. Let's call this. Should do the old metallic pea green for the vacation reference. Anyway, sorry. So now this is a named color. It's no longer an unnamed color because we just saved it. So to sort of recap, there's a couple different ways to create colors and save colors. You can mix it within the object and then save it later, or you can start just by using a new color swatch, and then again it defaults to whatever the last one you used, and you can throw your mixes here, and if let's do like an orangey. I'm not going to save this, but you can mix right from your new swatch palette, or you can make a shape and fill it and then mix it with your color palette here and then save it after the fact. So there are a couple different ways to create new colors. But again, in InDesign, you need to have, well, you don't need to, but it's a good idea to save your colors, to name your colors, so that they remain within the document. Now you'll see if we delete this, that oval is gone, but our sweet 70s green is still there. So we can use that later if we want to, right? Another thing with working with process colors, when you want to create a lighter version of a color, what you want to do, instead of playing with opacity, which we do in Illustrator, Photoshop, instead of playing with opacity, again, because it's a print process, we work with what's called tints. And basically a tint, sometimes designers or professionals will call all process colors tints, because technically they are. It's like a mix of colors. But in InDesign, a tint refers specifically to a lighter version of a color. So if you wanted to create a lighter version of our violet red, let's say, instead of playing with the object and playing with the opacity, or in this case the tint, in InDesign, you can create a new tint color. So I'm just gonna, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Let's go back to our handy ellipse. Where's my mouse? There it is. And then I'm just gonna make an ellipse with our violet red here. But let's say we want to make this a lighter version of the violet red. What you can do, you'll see we have here, let's make it 50%. So tint and opacity are two very different things. You'll see how, even though we're bringing down the tint, right, it's a lighter color, but it's still a solid color, as opposed to playing with opacity in Illustrator or Photoshop. You would see that text showing through this color if you played with opacity, right? And again, since we're working with print output, it's still technically 100% opacity. It's just a tint of that color. It's a lighter version of that color. That's not to say that you can't have opacities in, like, let's say you wanted this to be, an opacity of the violet red. You can still set the opacity, but it's going to be different than creating a lighter color. You're specifically, if you wanted a lighter version of this violet red, you would be creating a tint of that color rather than bringing down the opacity. It's just another way that those color separations are done. If you have opacity, you can run into issues with color separations and print process if you wanted a lighter version of this color. So to save, let's see, it should, let's see. So to create a new tint, let's bring this back up to 100. So we're going to, bless you, so we're going to create a tint of this violet red. So we're going to do, you'll see we have a different option here. We're going to do a new tint swatch. And then you'll see all of this information is not editable, right? Because it's a different version of an existing color. So you're not changing the name, you're not changing the type or the mode, you're not changing the mix. All you're doing is you're changing the tint. So we'll change the tint to 50, and then we'll hit OK, and you can see now it goes back to, I'm going to deselect. And then let's say for argument's sake you wanted a new tint at 20, and now we have our tint of that color at 50 and 20%. And again, you'll see it's still 100% opaque. It's just a lighter version of that color. And I know it can kind of get confusing, the opacity versus tint thing. But basically, the tints are when you want to create a lighter version of a color. You don't want to create opacity, right? Does that make sense?
Basically,
okay.
Opacity is going to allow you to see what's, say, behind.
Exactly. Yeah. Opacity is going to be playing with, yeah, is right how transparent the object is. Whereas creating lighter colors, you actually need to create a tint of that color, right? So playing with the opacity isn't changing the color at all, it's just changing the transparency. Yeah.
Is it basically it's adding white to the color as you bring the tint down? But it's technically creating
kind of
a new color. Why doesn't it change the CMYK value?
Because you're not changing the value any.
But it's technically a brand new color. I guess what I'm wondering is
it isn't. It isn't. It's just it's not a new yeah. It gets it can get really confusing.
Make that color on a CMYK, like if you went and made that color, you could do that on there, but it's not giving you those, or is it something completely different?
No, it's something different. It's you. So what you're doing is, so with this violet red, right? I'll double click it so we can get the info. We have our color mix, right? And then with our tint, we don't want to change. Now we can actually change the values here because we're editing the swatch. But you don't want to change the actual mix of the color. But what the tint is doing is it's changing. It's not necessarily adding white, but it's basically just changing like the color saturation, which is like how much ink is laid down, basically. You know what I mean? So you're basically changing the saturation of the color, and that's what that's where InDesign and Illustrator differ.
When you go to process it, it has to do with the ink, and you want to be able to use the same ink.
Correct.
Than just
because it's still
in a different way.
Yes.
And not as much. Okay.
Yep. It's because you still want that same mix of CMYK. Right. You just want a lighter version of it. Okay. So you're just going to be doing that same, technically that same mix. It's just going to lay down at a different ratio, I guess, for lack of at a different saturation. So if you're using an inkjet, it's just gonna spray less. Okay. It's gonna spray less of the same mix. It's kind of like you're doing that same mix at 50%, or you're doing that same mix at 25%. So you're just So that's if you just created a color just by changing the mix a little bit, then you're creating an entirely different color. You're not creating a lighter version of that color.
Yep, that makes sense.
Okay. That one I have a tendency to over-explain a lot because tints can get really confusing really easily. So the creating tints of a color, again, you just go to the color that you want to create a tint of. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, and then new tint swatch, and then you change your tints, whatever you want there. I'm going to cancel it, and then you'll see it shows up. It shows up here. Tints we went through. So applying colors, there's of course a variety of different ways, different places to apply these colors. You can select an object just like most Adobe programs, and just select the color. Once you have your colors created, select the color that you want to apply, and you'll see you have your fill and your stroke. I'm going to actually take the stroke off so that we don't have anything. Oops, that's not what I wanted. There we go. So we don't have anything. That line that's showing is just the what's it called? The edge of the graphic. It's not actually a color. And again, you can change it up here as well. It has the same information. You'll see the same swatch information for the fill and the stroke, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing the book walks you through, honestly, I tend not to use it a lot. I don't know many people that do use this way to do it, but you can actually drag and drop colors. I find there's a spot in the book where they have you change, I think, like this black square behind this white one, and it's really easy to miss. But you can drag and drop. So if you drag and drop a color, like I feel like it's kind of gimmicky, but you know, whatever. So you can see, like, if you drag to the fill or you can drag to the stroke, and you can see that sort of barely changes. Let me zoom in a little bit. So if you're dragging to the fill, it has that black square on our arrow here. So if I were to let go on this cyan that it's already on, it would fill. It would apply the color to the fill. But then if I wanted to hit that stroke, you see how that changed from a square to a line. So now it's going to fill that. It's going to apply. I shouldn't say fill. It's going to apply that stroke or that color to the stroke rather than the fill, right? But you can see how it's pretty easy to miss if you. Personally, I find it honestly easier just to select the object that you're going to change and just do it here rather than try to drag and drop. But I don't know, if you guys personally find dragging and dropping works for you, then go for it. I have a tendency to miss a lot, so it's just easy enough. It's easy enough for me to select the object and hit it and, you know, do my thing there. So the different ways to apply colors, again, is, you know, by selecting the object, selecting the fill or stroke, and going through whatever colors you want. I just wasn't even looking while I was doing that, and so we have our. That's terrible. I can't look at that. Sorry. So we have our. Let's make the stroke a little wider so we can see it. There we go. So we have our violet red with our pea green stroke, which isn't much better to look at, but. So yeah, so applying colors, you can just click through your swatches once you have them set up. You can drag and drop as well. Again, the book has you walk through changing this color, changing this stroke color as well. Definitely try it. Again, personally, it doesn't work for me. You guys might find it super handy. A handy shortcut in InDesign is hitting the X button, the X key. Swaps your active fill or stroke. So if you want to quickly switch, if you're on a fill and you want to change your stroke there, you can just hit X and it'll automatically activate the stroke. That's a handy shortcut. To be honest, I've never really tried it in Illustrator. It might work in Illustrator too. I don't think it does. I could be wrong. Do I have Illustrator open? All right, I'm trying it. Let's go to, let's see. Oh, it does work in Illustrator. Look at that. So in Illustrator or InDesign, that handy, I totally forgot it. I never use it, and it's super handy, and I don't know why I never use it. I always either just click the fill or the stroke to activate it, or sometimes I'll hit that little, if we zoom in again, hit this little arrow that swaps the fill and the stroke. Or you can, again, you can hit that X. Oops, I don't want to, no, I want to swap it. Sorry, I don't want to swap it. I want to, there we go. I usually just hit the actual fill or the stroke to activate it, but you can hit that X and it swaps which one is active. Pretty handy. Pretty handy, and I always forget about it. Dragging and dropping we talked about. I think. We talked a little bit at the very beginning of class about the none fill versus the paper fill. Whereas like none is obviously no fill, right? So anything behind this will show, or the paper fill, the paper fill, which is essentially white. And the reason that they call it paper is to let the paper, whatever the substrate's going to be, show through. So you're not going to have, obviously, like the sky behind this, right? It's essentially, I shouldn't say it's essentially white, but they basically don't have technically like white in InDesign, because it's whatever, it's going to depend on whatever you're printing on. If you're printing on white paper, then it's going to be white. If you're printing on blue paper, then this is going to be blue. If you're printing on green paper, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why they call it paper. So it's just going to depend on what your output is. And that's the only reason that they call it paper. But this is basically when you fill with the paper swatch, it's basically not going to show anything that's behind it, right? It's going to be essentially a knockout. So it's going to not put ink in this area, right? But if you did want, obviously, whatever was behind that to show, then you would have a none fill, which sounds weird to say. So there's a couple different ways. Also okay, so moving on to, are there any questions about that in general? Sorry. I feel like I'm like flying through this. So applying color to text is similar. There's a couple different ways to apply color to text. I believe, I don't know if it'll let us drag and drop. Nope. I was seeing if I could hit a corner or something like that. So what you can do, a couple different ways to change color in text is if you double click any text areas, you can select and change the text color. And you can see here, now it's still moving. Now our fill looks a little bit different, right? It's got a T indicating that you're changing the text color rather than the frame color. And again, this is something that's very different from Illustrator. You can change, you can have the frame, in this case, you could have the frame be yellow and the text be this violet red. You just want to indicate what you are changing, right? So if you want to change, that's not what I want to do. Changing the color of the text, you can either, again, double click and select what you want to change. Like if you wanted to have these be two different colors, for example, change that to our green. So now we have two different colors in our text. Or if you wanted all of the text to be the same color, here's where we would want to indicate what we're filling, right? And the reason there's question marks here is because they're two different colors. So this indicates what you're formatting. You're formatting the frame. So if we were to change the color to our green, it's going to change the color of the frame. I'm going to undo that. And if we hit the text, we're going to change the formatting of the text, but it's going to change everything within that text frame, right? So if you want something to be, the reason that you would use, and that's really the two different ways to change the color of text. You can either select, format the text, and select the color that you want to use, or if you want to get more specific, like again, if you wanted to have, this fall 2015 be a different color than the 495, you would specifically go in. You can use your text tool, or again, double click and it brings up, but you would select what you actually want to have be that different color. And that would be the reasons to use this directly selecting the text versus formatting the text within the frame. That would be one of the uses of why you would use that selection processes. If you wanted a different color with text that's in the same frame, right? But again, it works similarly, applying text or applying color to text physically works in a similar manner. You're applying any of these swatches that you've created to the text. One of the other things that the book goes through and that I'll show you is our handy drop shadow. A lot of times if you have, let's say, for example, this text here, let's say we want to make this text, I'm trying to hopefully get a color that doesn't show too well or read too well here, but you get the idea. It doesn't read too badly actually, but let's say we want this to pop out a little bit more. You can create a simple drop shadow, which is an old trick. We went through all that. Sorry, I'm looking at my colors, or my notes. So what we're going to do is I'm going to copy this, or you can go to Edit, Copy, and then I'm going to do a paste in place. And this is where I really wish that they would bring the paste in back that they have in Illustrator. But what we can do here is I'm going to change this text. We'll change it to black. Oh, that's a tint. I don't want it to be a tint. I hit that by accident. And I'm just going to nudge it over a couple to the left and a couple down. And then I'm going to arrange. There's a couple different ways you can arrange, but what you want to do is I'm going to send it backward. Again, this is why I wish they had the, there we go. That's why I wish they had the paste behind so that it would skip that step. But now you can kind of see that just by throwing that little bit of a black drop shadow behind this text, it pops out a little bit more. Another thing you can do is if you go into your layers, so we have our text here, you know, before this was over, so you can grab the text on top and just drag it behind as well, if you wanted to go into your layers and do that. But having drop shadows is a very simple way to make text stand out on top of photos. Specifically photos where, let me select both of these, you know, where you have the text either drop out, like if you have a light color on a light background. That's not perfect, but you can see, you get the idea where it stands out a little bit more with the drop shadow behind it. And then, I shouldn't say lastly, but one of the other things we'll talk about is working with spot colors. So working with spot colors, specifically one of the more common uses of spot colors are your PMS colors, Pantone matching colors. So to create a new spot color, there's a couple different ways you can do it. If you have, which our assignment brings us through, if you have an image, I'm going to go to File, Place, maybe, there we go. I always use a shortcut, so it takes me a while. I need to find our book materials. There we go. We're in chapter 5. So we're going to be placing this livinggraphic.ai. And I'm just going to hit open. And I'm just going to arbitrarily place it. So you'll see we've placed this. I think for the assignment we're actually going to place it into this frame. I just kind of popped it on the drawing board just to show you. But you'll see, since this is an AI file that has a color assigned to it already, once we place that color, it's created the Pantone 159 swatch, which is that specific orange swatch. So now, theoretically, watch it prove me wrong. There we go. It already created a named color. So now we have that Pantone 159 no matter what, even if we got rid of that graphic, placing any graphic within the file that has a color specifically assigned to it is going to automatically appear in your named swatches. The other thing is, if you know, let's say, for argument's sake, we want this fill to be a different Pantone color that we're creating, we're going to do a new color swatch, and instead of doing a process color, we're going to do a spot color, and then I'm going to pick my Pantone Plus solid coated, and it may or may not take a little while to load. Mine didn't take that long at all. And now you'll see you have your giant Pantone library. You can search for colors. Generally, if you're going to be doing this, you know what color you're going to be looking for. You're not just kind of like arbitrarily sliding through this to look for a color, because it's going to take all day. So I'm going to type in 200 for this reddish color. I was hoping for a bluish, but I just arbitrarily typed in a color. So it's automatically going to name it, since we're using a spot color and we're using this Pantone matching system. So we're going to hit OK. And then now we've filled it with that Pantone red. And then it is also a named color in our palette. So that's how you create a spot color swatch, specifically using Pantone. But again, you can use any of these other, if you're using another book for whatever reason. To tell you the truth, I've never used any of these books. That doesn't mean that you wouldn't in your endeavors. But like, I don't know, let's check out what the Toyo color finder looks like. It looks very similar. It's just different, a different numbering system. So anyway, so to create this, let's grab this blue, whatever that means. Color finder, I'm assuming, and that's the color, similar to like PMS 200. Like, it's relatively arbitrary. It's just what they named that color. So now we have our Toyo color match, color finder, whatever, 10526, blah blah blah. So now we have that as a named color. So that's working with spot colors. And basically, this, again, the spot color refers to any specific color that you're using from a color matching system, versus a process color, which is a Cmyk mix, right? And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about gradients. So we have this assignment 5.2 InDesign file. Working with gradients, you need to create, again, like any other swatch in here, you need to create a gradient swatch, right? Which is pretty simple. All we're going to be doing is, instead of new color swatch, we're going to be creating a new gradient swatch. And you'll see we have some different options. We'll call this blue, green, gold. The type of gradient, if you want a linear or a radial gradient, we're going to go with, bless you, we're going to go with linear. And here is where you actually create the gradient. Right now it defaults to, here's your gradient ramp, your color stops, and then your blending stop. Again, if you guys are familiar with working with this in Illustrator or other applications, it looks very similar. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be changing this stop to a blue, and here's where we have our options. This is where it differs. You can have, you know, your lab, CMYK, RGB swatches. You have your variety of places to choose from. So for right now, we're going to choose from our swatches, and you'll see now it brings up our list reflected here. So I'm going to make a color stop. I'm going to make that blue, and then I'm going to take this one, I'm going to go to our swatches, and I'm going to make that gold. And then I wanted to add the green in the middle. So like, very similar to Illustrator, I'm going to add a color stop just by hovering sort of at the bottom of our gradient slider, and I'm just going to click once to create a new stop, and then I'm just going to type in 50% and hit tab so I know it's right in the middle. Tab just so I don't hit OK, but so I go to the next thing. And I'm going to go to my swatches, and I'm going to select the green. So now it goes the blue, green, gold. And then I'm going to hit OK. And now we have our blue, green, gold gradient that we can apply to our objects. You can adjust this gradient with our gradient tool here, our gradient feather tool they call it. So you can see by dragging either left to right or right to left, we'll swap that gradient. So if we wanted it to go from left to right, I'm going to hold shift so it's right down the middle here from edge to edge of our graphic. So now we have this fill gradient going from left to right. If you wanted it going up and down, you could fill it that way. I believe, yeah, you can also double click and you can get a little bit more specific gradient info. You can change it to a radial gradient. I'll change it in here so it looks a little bit better. You can reverse the gradient this way. You can change the angle of the gradient if you know. Let's do like 60. So you can see like the angle where the gradient breaks is about here-ish. So you have a little bit more options when you double click that gradient tool, or under window you can also bring up your gradient palette as well. To apply, I'm going to go back to my select tool. To apply a gradient across multiple objects, you need to use your gradient tool. So if I select these three objects and I click my gradient color, right, you can see it fills all three gradients, or all three objects rather, with the same gradient repeated. But we want it to go across all three of these objects. This is where you're going to grab your gradient tool. And again, I'm going to go about in the middle. I'm going to hold shift just to keep it straight down the middle. And now you can apply the gradient across multiple objects. And you can do that for, you know, if you wanted to do, let's go back to our gradient tool here. And I'm going to go down that way. So now you can have this gradient apply to all these objects. So you can select pretty much as many objects as you want and just use that gradient tool to drag across all of the objects to where you want that gradient to flow, you know, again, to sort of kill it. Now you can see it goes through all the objects. And then again, applying the radial gradient versus a linear gradient. The radial is just going to be starting from the middle out. So if you wanted to reverse that, you could have that yellow be the middle. Where you want, let's say you wanted this to be a little bit more dimensional. This is where you could use your gradient feather, and you could kind of have that starting and ending point, you know, to create a little bit of dimension. So you have your middle here, you can have sort of like a highlight-ish, kind of create a little bit of dimension just by sort of giving this kind of highlight hotspot and just dragging it down. You can change that location with the gradient feather tool across this object to sort of give it that a little bit of a spherical, I know it's not exactly, but a little bit of a spherical look. You can start playing with a little bit of dimension there. And that's about it I wanted to cover for gradients. Gradients are relatively simple. Once you learn how to create color, creating gradients, again, is pretty simple. You're just creating that new gradient swatch and then again, it's going to default to the last one that we used. I will show you one last thing. So let's say for argument's sake, it defaulted to the last gradient that we created. And let's say you want this next gradient just to be 2 colors. You want to get rid of this color stop. All you do is hold it and drag it down, and now you've deleted that color stop. So what happens a lot, I do it more in Illustrator, but what happens a lot is I'll go to adjust or something, or whatever, and I'll accidentally click down here by accident a lot. And I'll be like, oops, I created a new stop by accident, so then I'll just drag it down. So if you just drag it away from your color bar, that's how you get rid of color. So let's say we wanted just to be a 2 color gradient. Again, you can go to your swatches, or you can have a Cmyk mix if you wanted to. But for this purpose, I'm going to I'll go pink. Let's go pink to red, and then I'll name it pink red. And now we have our pink red gradient to play around with. And the only reason that it filled it across all 3 objects is because it was before, so it remembered that these 3 objects were essentially like attached, you know what I mean? So now we have our pink red 2 color gradient instead of a 3 color gradient. If you wanted to make a 6 color gradient, you just add more stops, if you all that fun stuff. So once you know how to create colors in general, creating gradient swatches is really just one more step of playing around with the color sliders. The color sliders within that swatch palette. Any questions?
I do.
Okay.
What would the registration swatch there be used for?
So registration swatch is, it's kind of like, well, it's not like it at all. It's kind of like, it's kind of like paper conceptually. So the registration swatch is essentially black. It's not technically black because you can see it's a fill of all the colors. So it's where black is just everything is 0 except for black, where registration, it's 100% of everything. And basically what the registration is, it's a printer's mark. So it's essentially like a target that would be outside of, like let's say this is our document that we're printing for the sake of talking about it. So this is our document that we're printing, right? A registration mark would be placed like outside of here, and usually it depends, but usually there's one at the top, bottom, left, and right, and it looks like a little target. And basically what that is it's used for when you do color separations, you line up those targets, and then everything will line up. It's basically lining up your plates. So as long as you're hitting those registration marks. And the reason that it's different from black, if it was just black and you do your color separations, it would only appear on your black plate. And I say plate's sort of like a general term. It's one of those printing terms where you use to output to plates and blah, blah, blah. But plates can mean a variety of different things. It's just the separation. So the if you just had your mark black, since everything else is 0 except for black, that mark would only appear on the black separation. Whereas since everything in the registration, since all of it is at 100%, you would have that mark on your cyan plate. You would have that mark on your yellow plate. You know what I mean? So it just ensures that you have that registration color in the same spot on all of your plates. So the main difference is registration is 100% of all the colors, where black is 100% of just black. And the reason you would use registration over, not just for registration marks, but the reason you would have registration versus black is so that you have that fill, saturation, whatever attribute you want to have on every single separation. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
Yeah.
Okay. When it gets into more advanced printing things, it makes a little bit more sense,
Right.
But it's basically the main difference. The main difference is registration is 100% of the 4 colors, where black is 100% of just black.
This is like a guideline.
The registration marks, yes.
Yeah.
But it's a separate color. Again, it's a separate color because,
Right.
yeah, 9.999 times out of 10, you're usually just using registration for registration marks or for printer's mark, crop marks, things like that, which we'll get into later. But it basically is just, it ensures that you have those marks on every single separation, rather than just on one color separation.